Welcome everyone to another webinar offered by the International Council of Psychologists. I'm Andy Simon, I'm on the board of directors of ICP. And as always, we're really pleased to offer you another timely and really interesting topic with first-rate experts today. Our topic, as you know, is COVID-19 and vulnerable populations. This particular session is on Indigenous peoples and is thoroughly consistent with ICP's mission to serve people around the world around issues of social justice and human rights. So we have about 75, 80 people that are watching right now from around the globe. And just so you know how we're going to structure today's presentation, we're going to have about 15, 20 minutes from each of our two presenters. And then at the end of the session, we're going to present questions. So you will notice on your screen that at the bottom, there's a little chat icon. There's also a Q&A icon, whichever one you prefer to use. Please type in your questions. It would help me a lot if your questions can be somewhat concise. And then I will take your questions and present them to our speakers today. So without any further delay, let me introduce our two experts. We have with us today Dr. Hilary Weaver, who is a member of the American Indian Lakota tribe and an associate dean and professor at the University of Buffalo. As both a practitioner, an academic, a scholar, a researcher, she's advocated for the rights of Indigenous peoples throughout her careers. She has presented and published extensively in her area of expertise and is currently working on a book on contemporary Native American issues viewed through the dual lenses of trauma and resilience. So we will be hearing from Hilary Weaver at the end of today's presentation. Right now, I would like to introduce Dr. Fernando Pessoa Albuquerque. He has been responsible for the Special Secretariat of the Indigenous Health of the Brazilian Department of Health since 2013. He has specialized in assisting populations within Brazil and has written extensively on Indigenous populations in Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Paraguay. So, Fernando, without any further delay, please begin your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I would want to thank the ICP for the invite me for this presentation. It's a moment so important for me and for us in Brazil. We that have no other chance. We have one more chance for indigenous people in Brazil, and we are on a battle for preserve and prevent the dissemination of COVID-19 in indigenous lands. Well, wait a moment here. Are you seeing my presentation? Yes?
Yes, you are fine. You can just go right ahead.
Nice. Well, I am Fernando. I am Fernando Pessoa. I'm from Brazil, and I am a psychologist, and I've worked with public health for 13 years, being 8 years with indigenous people from Brazil, coordinating and developing psychosocial care actions for indigenous peoples who have their own ways of feeling and expressions their sufferings. Well, in addition, I am currently finishing my doctorate in collective health and public health at the University of São Paulo, where I study the organization of the psychosocial care network in Brasilia, capital of Brazil. Well, in this presentation, like you can see, the presentation says it's the national health system that we Brazilians call as SUS, Sistema Único de Saúde in Portuguese, ensuring integral health to indigenous people. Oh, wait a moment. Here. Okay. Well, in Latin America, we have as whole comprise 522 indigenous people with about 45 million of persons who represent 8.3% of the population. A study from United Nations also estimates that there are 200 indigenous people in voluntary isolation in Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Venezuela, uh, and with the Brazilian Amazon have the largest numbers of records of these people that who lives in voluntary isolation. Well, this is the oh, wait a moment. This is the Yanomami people who live in a territory between Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela, and they are so traditional people that live in small villages inside in the forest, in the rainforests of Amazon. Well, in Brazil, we have almost 1 million indigenous. This number is from 2010 census, and the physical population is growing. More than 700,000 are living in indigenous lands, with their territories demarcated by the federal government, who should protect their borders and who live there. But we have a big problem for protecting these territories, especially in nowadays. 300,000 of indigenous lives in the city. 60% of indigenous live at the north region of Brazil. Altogether, we have 305 ethnic groups who speaks who speak 274 different languages. It's a huge diversity of people and a big challenge to guarantee rights and health care for all these people. Even more, because in Brazil there are almost 5,000 indigenous villages, small villages, and 90% of them have less than 100 people. Our indigenous village is so much dispersed, on all territory of Brazil. Uh, to date, data from the Indigenous Health Secretariat of the Ministry of Health in Brazil reported the occurrence of 2,894 cases of COVID-19 and 97 deaths in indigenous people living in indigenous territories. We have a lack in this data because we don't have the knowledge of indigenous cases that lives in the city. Oops. Well, these people suffer a historical invisibility, which covers their history of violence, oppression, and genocide resulting from contact with Western society, with the white people. Currently, there is a great weakness in the territorial protection of indigenous lands, which suffer from constant invasions by miners, loggers, and illegal farmers. This situation makes these traditional communities not only more susceptible to COVID-19, but also to the discrimination of their culture and the traditional ways of living, oppressed also by contact with capitalist society and the presence of missionaries in indigenous lands. There are a phrase that I like so much. That it's from Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. It's a Brazilian anthropologist that says, if genocide kills people in their bodies, ethnocide kills them in their spirits. Well, here. Well, as social and cultural transformation involved in contact with non-indigenous society, they contribute to occurrence of problems related to mental health and conflicts in family and community relationships. During a pandemic, it is expected that we often on alert, worried, confused, stressed, and feeling lack of control in the face of the uncertainties of the moment. According to a study by a Brazilian university, the Fiocruz, it is estimated that between one third and half of the population exposed to an epidemic may suffer some form of psychological distress. These sufferings are aggravated in situations of social vulnerability, as is the case with indigenous peoples. The COVID-19 has altered the social relations and cultural practices of indigenous people due to the need for social isolation and the distance, and the need to restrict the movement of people between villages, in addition to the fears that the disease causes. This context can worsen the mental health and well-being of the indigenous people. These conditions demand from the health sector, investment and intensification of primary healthcare actions that care for and offer support to indigenous people in psychological distress, guaranteeing psychosocial care in the village. Historically, the indigenous populations has been more vulnerable to contagion by respiratory viruses, but both due to immunological issues as well their community's way of living. In the case of COVID-19, vulnerability is also increased by social conditions and the health situations of the different ethnic groups that inhabit Brazil. Many of the elders today still remember the effects of these epidemic outbreaks and can tell us about the measures they have taken to protect themselves and treat themselves in the context of communities. We are faced with the need to develop intercultural strategies to communicate risks and involve indigenous communities to detect, prevent, and respond the emergence of a new respiratory virus. Well, talking about protective factors, we can say, né? But we have to ask first what the protection factors for these people in the face of yet another epidemic. We have to think that a lot of small ethnic groups with the contact with the non-indigenous people lost a big part of their group, because some anthropologists says that in the first contact, some people, 70% of the group of ethnic group that will have no contact with the so the Western society uh, can die by flu or malaria or another disease that they didn't know yet. The distance from the village to the urban center with the highest incidence of COVID-19 is one of protective factors. Especially the collective is a central ethos that the collective way of life is a central ethos that permits various aspects of daily life in many indigenous cultures, from extended family coexistence, community work, and production, food sharing, and other groups' activities. If they isolated themselves collectively, we have a protection measure. In an article in the Lancet journal, it was observed that community decisions and agreements for realizing collective isolation as the most viable strategy to minimize exposure to COVID-19 until vaccines or treatment becomes available for indigenous. Some communities in Brazil, such as Jamamadi, from the south of Amazonas, the state of Amazonas, have been moving to old villages located far from the cities and going further into the rainforest to get away from the contact with the new coronavirus. Well, but we have a lot of risk factors. Unfortunately, we have many risk factors that can cause COVID-19 to decimate ethnic groups at risk. The social, environmental, and community conditions that many people in live in can make them even more vulnerable to complications arising from the coronavirus, especially in communities that live in indigenous reserves, which do not have space to reproduce their traditional ways of life, as is the case of the Guarani Kaiowá in Brazil or Mapuche or people Mapuche in Chile. In Brazil, Chile, and the other countries such as Colombia and Paraguay, uh, many indigenous communities live in rural areas currently degraded by the agribusiness and far from health service, which can represent a great vulnerability to these peoples in the face of the pandemic. There is a need for primary health care to actively search for respiratory cases in each village. Another risk factor closely related to the mental health sphere is the suffering caused by the impossibility of performing traditional funeral rites, imposed by the impediment of contact with the body of the deceased, of somebody that died for COVID-19. In the Yanomami, for example, when a leader dies, they let the body dry for 3 days in the rain in the forest, but put it on a fire, and then eat a banana porridge. It's a mix the, with the ashes of the person that dies to celebrate his death and ingest his teachings. The inability to perform the traditional burial rites has caused conflict between indigenous people and the local governments, and is also a risk factor for for mental disorders resulting from the inability to live the grieving process. This is a traditional initiation rite of by the Carajá. Is a people who lives in Brazil. One moment. Oops. Here. Well, when approaching the theme of mental health in indigenous contexts, we are faced with some dilemmas. One of them concerns the notion that mind or psyche are not a part of the cosmology of most of these peoples, who have other conceptions about body, spirit, individual, and family, which go beyond any Western epistemology, such as psychology. In order to understand the subjective dimension of the suffering of an individual, family, or peoples, it's necessary to know the social culture organization of the community, emotion, uh, since the emotional experience is a record of the culture. I'm finishing at the moment. In this question of mental health, we will work considering multiple factors, mainly the social culture factors. The relations inside the communities or in the family and the indigenous perspective. After all, some of them understand that some mental problems are caused by witchcrafts or by forest spirits from the hand forest. We think that any intervention should be elaborated with the community and have to interact with these three dimensions, in particular, in particular, the indigenous knowledges. Therefore, I take up the words of an indigenous leaders named Anastácio Guarani Kaiowá when talking about the suicide of young indigenous of his people. He said, "My people do not suffer from depression. My people suffer from oppression. Oppression of our culture, our Guarani way of life." It's the people from Guarani Kaiowá. Our children are like that because they are so far from Tekoha. Tekoha is the name that they give to the house of the soul in Guarani. And like the young Guarani is far from Tekoha, there is no being without a home. They say to us that there is no being without a home, that it would be the Tekoha. This leader still complements that the indigenous people need actions that promote buen vivir this is a term of uh, indigenous movements. I'm finishing. Wait a moment, only to leave a message for us. This indigenous leader says, we have to create modes of productions and ways of organized society in which life is worth living. Well, only to finish my presentation, I want to leave you with a phrase. Well, I want to leave us with a question by a sanitary doctor that helps to create the national health system in Brazil. He says, the health reform create a national health system, but its core is dehumanized and medicalized. Is wrong. We have to get into the heart of this model and change it. What is the base? First is health promotion, not to promote the disease. The national health system has to first ask what is happening in people's daily lives and how we can interfere to make it healthier. Only to finish, we have to ask for the indigenous and make this narrative be expressed, asking, where did I come from, where I have been. This is a way to affirmate and empoderity of these subjects for his own knowledge about their culture and their community ways of life. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Fernando. You should know that we are getting comments from people that are just thanking you for this. They love your slides. We have several questions that I'll be presenting, but right now we want to transition to Hilary Weaver's presentation. So, and then we will follow up with questions at the end. Hilary, please just go right ahead.
All right.
And Fernando, you and I can turn off our cameras.
Let's see. So I'll get my slideshow from the beginning. Thank you very much. I am very happy to be a part of this presentation. And I feel like some of the stories are coming true. There are many stories about the eagle and the condor coming together, the relatives from North and South America, and today we have a presentation that shares both. So I'm going to share the North American side. My presentation is COVID-19 and the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, unusual and familiar times. I say unusual because nothing like COVID-19 has happened during my lifetime. I think it has really turned the whole world upside down. Yet for Indigenous people, there is a familiarity about this. This is not our first pandemic. We have had many, many challenges. So it's in a context for us. I know I don't have much time for my presentation, so I want to make sure to share my email address with you. So anybody who is interested in reaching out to me, please do so. To give you a bit of a sense of who I am and how I approach this topic, I began with my children. And even on that first slide, there was a picture of an iris and an eagle. Those represent my children. Here they are in their human form. My daughter, Awen'ion, my son, Hadwanayandos. I am Lakota, but I have spent the majority of my adult life in Haudenosaunee territory, which is the northeastern part of the United States and the southeastern part of Canada. I am a social worker. I write a lot about contemporary Native American issues. And yeah, so I'm happy to speak with you about this. This is right up my alley because I'm always trying to observe what is happening for us as contemporary Indigenous peoples. Here's a book cover that my daughter drew for me many years ago. You see from my title, I talked about Turtle Island. That is part of a traditional teaching for many Native American tribes. There is a sense that North America exists on the back of a turtle. Here it is depicted there. Over here, I have a picture of the United States in outline, but these borders are not ours. The real picture is over here, Turtle Island, North America. As Indigenous people, it's not so much that we crossed borders, but that borders crossed us. So we have relatives all across Turtle Island, whether it is Canada, the United States, Mexico, we are all related. In the United States, the latest figures say that there are about 6.79 million Native Americans, or 2% of the population. There are well over 500 different Native American nations. We have 326 reservations, but many Native Americans who do not live on reservations. In fact, the majority of our population, between 2/3 and 3/4, do not live on our tribal territories. On the Canadian side, there are about 1.67 million Indigenous peoples, or 4.9% of the population, more than 600 different bands on more than 3,000 different reserves, and just under half of their populations live on their traditional territories. To understand where we are with COVID-19, I think you need to understand a little bit about the contemporary experiences of Native Americans. If you look at just about any statistic, whether it's a health statistic, a social statistic, an educational statistic, an economic statistic, statistics on violence or being involved with the criminal justice system, you will note that Indigenous people suffer some of the worst disparities. I think a lot of this is tied to colonization and the situation that we have found ourselves in, the displacement, the social determinants of health. Even basic things like clean water. Many Indigenous people on Turtle Island lack access to clean water. 58 out of every 1,000 Native American households lack complete plumbing, as opposed to 3 out of every 1,000 white households. That figure is from the United States. Access to clean water is a tremendous problem on the Canadian side as well. Many tribes have had boil water advisories in place for years. There is tremendous environmental racism, contamination of the air, contamination of the soil. All of these affect our health status. Poverty affects our access to adequate shelter. You have a lot of people that don't have regular heat in their homes, or their overcrowded homes. There are a lot of limits on infrastructure in terms of who has access to electricity, much less access to internet. You also need to understand the tensions between sovereignty and paternalism. We continue to exist as Indigenous nations, and you'll notice that I use the term nations much more than I use the term tribe. We existed prior to the United States or Canada or Mexico or any of these borders that have come to transcend us. We existed prior to US citizenship. In 1924, the United States decided to make Native Americans citizens of the United States. Many Indigenous peoples kind of laughed that off. Some people did want to be included, others did not, and thought it was ridiculous. How can you decide that all of a sudden we are Americans? And in fact, the Jay Treaty that sets the boundary between the United States and Canada says that an Indigenous person is an Indigenous person, regardless of which side of that artificial boundary somebody is born on. So we cross these borders. But the federal government of the United States and Canada as well has a very paternalistic attitude. Treaties were established between Indigenous peoples and the European powers that came. We saw this as relationships among siblings, where we would give up things like land in exchange for things like food, for health services, for educational opportunities. But yet the US federal government and Canada as well has always enacted those in very condescending, paternalistic ways. However, we are resilient. There is a reemergence. Traditions continue in contemporary times. And it's not just the people who live in isolated areas, it's very much those of us in urban areas as well. So I think that foundation that I laid out kind of sets the stage for COVID-19 and how that has impacted our communities. By treaty, the United States is supposed to provide health services for Indigenous people. And in fact, there is something called Indian Health Service. It is always persistently underfunded, even though the US Constitution says that treaties are the supreme law of the land and should be held above any other law or legal system. We have never received the funding for our health services. And in fact, convicted murderers in the federal penitentiary system receive more funding for their health services than Indigenous people do by a long way. So we do have a disproportionate disease burden that really has taken a toll on us. We have crowded housing and limited access to many things that people find basic. The picture over here in the middle, well, that's a medical center. And I don't know what communities you come from, but I would guess that for most of you, the medical center that you go to does not look like this. Well, this is what our medical centers look like. It is very, very basic. So when COVID-19 hit, there's very limited access to testing, very limited access to PPE. And when a health center in Seattle that served Native American people requested COVID-19 kits, many of you probably saw this on the news. They received body bags, cadaver bags. And, you know, some people would say, well, that's just a horrible mix-up, it's a mistake. But for those of us in Indian country, this is all too common because this is what we experience over and over and over. We have disproportionate infection and mortality rates, and it's magnified by ongoing systemic inequality. By mid-May, the Navajo Nation had higher per capita rates of COVID-19 than any state in the United States. And as of yesterday, that's 6,611 cases. And we're not talking a dense urban area. We're talking an area that is the largest reservation in the United States where people are very spread out, but live in overcrowded housing with limited access to water.
Hilary, could I just interrupt for a second? We're having a problem with our internet connection, so Mary's going to insert the slides so they're easier for everyone to see. So can you just please keep going and she'll take care of the slides?
Okay, do I need
Thank
to
you.
back up or are we?
Nope, you're fine. You
Okay,
can just
going forward?
continue. Yes.
All right, so I'm going to try and be a little bit happier because I think that there is a lot of resilience. So the slide that you're seeing now is the impact of COVID-19. If we could move to the next one and stop looking at the body bags, I'm going to talk to you about the resilience. Now wait for that slide to switch. There we go. So, you know what? We didn't wait for someone else to make things better. The Indigenous response to COVID-19 is active, it's proactive. People started sharing information immediately. There were so many webinars. There were so many people talking to each other about, what's happening in your community? What's happening over here? How can we help? People were developing culturally appropriate precautions. Up in British Columbia, Dr. Evan Adams was talking about stay-at-home orders there. Well, that includes staying on your territory, but get outside. Participate in traditional things like growing food and hunting and fishing, and you can do that under a stay-at-home order. Many reservations put in travel restrictions. In fact, 6 nations of the Grand River up in Ontario, they had an emergency response plan long before COVID-19. It was on the books, they implemented it. Protect the elders because that's where the language is, that's where the culture is. Keep people out, keep people off the reservations. There was a lot of encouragement for our traditional ways of fostering well-being, gathering medicine. Even Native Americans that were not really following a lot of traditional ways often have respect for the medicines. And when COVID-19 came, more people wanted to learn. They were going out to the bush. They were taking their children with them. Before they went, they would ask elders and neighbors who couldn't get out, what do you need? What can I gather for you? People are on the land, they're singing, they're dancing, they're learning, they're teaching the traditions. There's a tremendous resilience that has come about with COVID-19. There's a sense that we know what our communities need and we can develop and implement those strategies. And we can do those in new ways, including online. Part of this picture shows the social distance powwow, live from your own living room, where people can gather in real time and share information and do their dances and do their singing and tell their stories. This is a time of regeneration of the world and ourselves. It's been done with sovereignty because we have the strength and we can do this, but it is not done in isolation. It is done in partnership. I think we better go to the next slide. I know I'm kind of tight on time. I couldn't talk about the COVID-19 cooking responses anyway. Cooking's not quite my thing, but I like that picture. So I think you're getting the point that we are not passive. And many of the Indigenous people that I speak with see this as a time to be attentive. The earth is taking a breath, but so are we. What are we supposed to be learning in this time? Strawberries are a traditional medicine for many Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee around where I live. And COVID-19 was really hitting at the time when the strawberries were coming out. Go pick the strawberries, learn the stories, have the strawberry drink, get your sustenance, replenish your resilience. Kind of take inventory. What are our gifts and our responsibilities? Well, maybe somebody has a certain strength that they can share with somebody else. Maybe their gift is the ability to hunt and provide food for people who can't get out. And that is a responsibility as well as a gift. So this image down here of the purple and white, that's the Hiawatha belt for people who are not familiar with it. And it's an emblem made of wampum. which is a shell from the Northeast of the United States that was used to depict how people can come together, and warring Indigenous nations, people who had fought in the past, came together under the Great Tree of Peace. You'll see the tree in the middle, and that's where they buried the weapons of war. And there are extensions on either end for people to join together in friendship. And I see people talking about this having implications in contemporary times. Some of us have more resources than others. Some tribal nations have more infrastructure and can do more testing for COVID-19. So we better be reaching out to those people with less infrastructure and taking care of our neighbors. If we have things, we have responsibilities to others as well. People stand with us and we stand with others. Next slide, please. This is a sacred time. We are close to death. Thousands of people have died from COVID-19. Oh, we need to go back a slide. But we know that death is not now. Okay, is this a slide that, well, we'll figure out which slide we're on. We know that death is part of life. It's part and parcel of the same thing. So yes, we're in a global pandemic. There are many, many difficulties, but this is a sacred time and we should figure out what we're supposed to be learning from this time. People are coming together in ways that they have not in a very, very long time. And that's why I have these words in this picture I shared. They're attributed to Crazy Horse, but I think they're words that have been shared many, many times. I see a time of 7 generations when all the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life and the whole earth will become one circle again. There's a sense that we're in that time. Next slide, please. I think we're going backwards and that bird flies away. And we're in a time of learning technology. You know, a phrase that occurred to me was déjà vu all over again, because this is not our first pandemic. We have experience with disease and violence. We have centuries of experience with disease and violence and the epidemics that I would say devastated, but devastated sounds too complete. They had huge impacts on Indigenous communities, but we remain. A week or two ago, when I started planning this presentation, we were really being inundated with not just COVID-19, but certainly here in the United States, and I think around the world, we're seeing a lot of violence. That picture in the middle, where you see the burning building, that's Minneapolis. Riots that spun off of protests. And the building that is burning is the Native Youth Center, where they did job training for Native teenagers, where they had all of the computers, where they were learning video technology. And we have had things destroyed by fires before, like the Scorched Earth campaign, where General George Washington tried to kill every Native American in the state of New York. We've seen these destructions to our food supply and the things that we have built, but we have connections, we have relationships. So disease, violence, destruction, that doesn't sum things up. Next slide, please. It's about resilience. When the Sullivan Scorched Earth campaign happened, ordered by George Washington, they deliberately destroyed the food supply, which were ears of corn standing in the field. and the Native people had to make do with what was left after everything was burned. Now it's a tradition at our gatherings to have roasted corn soup because we salvaged what was left on those ears of corn. This is a time when warriors will rise. And I've got pictures of Dennis Banks there, you know, famous for the American Indian movement in Minneapolis. And there are people from the American Indian movement standing guard right now, protecting people in the violence that is happening in the United States. And there are other sorts of warriors, like the next picture that I have there is the director of the American Indian Cancer Research Center at Roswell Park. Rodney Herring, he is a Seneca, and he gathered Indigenous people from around the world, experts, to talk about COVID-19 and what is happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand, what is happening in Canada, what is happening at Navajo, what is happening in various places. That's a warrior these days. And elders are there to comfort us. Diane Longboat has been doing webinars on COVID-19, saying, you know, these are awful times, but as long as there is still smoke rising from the longhouse, as long as somebody is still able to lift a pipe in prayer, we're going to get through this. We're going to be okay. And the other picture is Faith Spotted Eagle of the Brave Women's Society. She's a Dakota elder. And she is teaching us how to move forward, how to get through this. The Brave Women's Society traditionally were the women who gathered the bodies from the battlefields. There are elders watching over us. There are role models that will rise, Native and non-Native, traditional and non-traditional. And, you know, there are times when I feel really down about COVID-19 and a lot of these things. But then I hear these people talking about the earth taking a breath and how we're going to find our way through this. And I believe that. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 is part of a whole. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's connected to all of these things. The past, our experiences with past pandemics, the present, the future. It's the disease and the violence, but it's the reinvigoration and the moving forward. We have multiple realities at the same time. We have a shared world, human and non-human, death and life in the same space, grief and joy. And the image of the blackberries is something that I've heard over and over when people talk about COVID-19. Blackberries are sacred, they are medicine, but boy, do they have thorns. If we were just discouraged by the thorns, if we let that sum up the reality of the blackberry, we would miss so much. We are in a time of thorns, but we will come out resilient and strong. In the last few weeks, I've heard helicopters and sirens with the violence that's going on here, including in my own neighborhood. But I also listen, and there are birds and there are people singing. Next slide, please. And as I wrap up, I know that we are moving forward. I'm thankful for another beautiful red day. The white buffalo, for those of you that know about the Lakota, this is a symbol of, you know, in very, very difficult times, there will be a bright future. And people are making this bright future. We're not passive. With COVID-19, we're doing things like these posters here in this slide that resonate with Indigenous people, that tell us what we need to do to get through this. And I am thankful to all of you and to the organizers, and I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up and leave it there.
Thank you, Hilary. This is just wonderful. Fernando, if you would also join us back on the screen again, We just have a few minutes left, but I would like to ask each of you to address a question that several of our participants have posed in different forms. We have people from Europe, North America, South America, all around the globe. And a general question that's showing up is, what can those of us in non-Indigenous populations do to support the Indigenous populations in your areas and around the world? Hilary, would you go first and just take a few minutes and discuss that?
Yeah, well, my one-word answer is listen, because each community will have different needs. So listen to the Indigenous people around you and see what they're saying they need. Is it some sort of PPE? Is it people to feed the elders? Is it people to stand guard? Listen, be an ally. This is a shared world. This is a shared pandemic. And allies are welcome to stand with us, but don't feel you need to step in and take over and decide what needs to be done. Begin by listening.
Great, thank you, Fernando.
Wait a moment. I will offer a bibliography of a Brazilian leader in Indigenous, that is the Ailton Krenak. He wrote a book he write about the ideas that could avoid the end of the world. And he says that we have to know of living with less things. The way of indigenous people of living, it's a way for we live in a one health. And one moment that is there is a text of him that he says that we have to understand that the humanity, it's only part of the biggest alive organism that is I have the phrase of him that is that they name like Pachamama, that they name like Yanderu in Guarani Kaiowá. That is this big earth. I think that we have to learn it and listen the indigenous and try live our lives with less things. I think
Thank you for this. Wonderful. Thank you very much to both of you. You should just know that not only are we getting so many questions, I'm only sorry we don't have more time to speak with each of you about this, but you're getting many thanks from people around the world, India, Europe, North and South America, sending their great thanks for these presentations, and people will be reaching out to you. So I want to thank you both. Thanks always to the people who participate in our webinars, to Mary Bullock, who's behind the scenes making all of this run. And our viewers should also know that this presentation has been recorded and will be posted and made available at no charge to anyone who wants to see it on the ICP webpage. So we hope to see both Hilary, Fernando, and you again. And I want to thank you very much for your expertise and for sharing that with all of us. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye for